Welcome to Silent Crime Case, where untold secrets and haunting betrayals come to light. In today's chilling story, we delve into the shadows of a family shattered by obsession, deceit, and an unthinkable act of vengeance. What begins as a journey of healing for a devoted father spirals into a dark tale of forbidden desires and devastating consequences. A loving son's admiration turns into obsession, and a father's trust is betrayed in the most unimaginable way. This is not just a story of love and loss, it's a cautionary tale of how betrayal can unravel even the strongest bonds, pushing a man to the brink of madness. How far would you go when the people you hold closest destroy your trust? And can a family ever recover from such a devastating fracture? Stay with us as we uncover the hidden motives, explosive emotions, and the shocking aftermath of a family torn apart. This is one silent crime case you won't forget. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, because the silence always hides the loudest truths. Ethan's life had always been defined by quiet determination and an unwavering sense of responsibility. As a young man, he was admired for his dedication to his work and his family. But when tragedy struck, these qualities were tested like never before. His wife Clara's sudden death shattered his world, leaving him to pick up the pieces and raise their only son, Lucas, on his own. Lucas was 18 at the time of Clara's passing, old enough to understand the gravity of their loss but young enough to still rely heavily on his father. For Ethan, grieving was a luxury he couldn't afford. He threw himself into his work as an electrician, working long hours to ensure Lucas could continue his education and pursue a stable future. The house, once filled with Clara's laughter and warmth, became eerily quiet. Mealtimes were somber, and the weekends dragged on without the family outings they used to cherish. Yet Ethan never let his grief interfere with his responsibilities. He was determined to provide Lucas with a sense of stability, even as his own heart broke. 2 years passed, and while the pain of Clara's loss remained, Ethan began to feel another void growing within him: loneliness. At 45, he started to entertain the idea of companionship again. He wasn't looking to replace Clara but to find someone who could help him navigate life's challenges and share the quiet moments that had become too heavy to bear alone. For the first time in years, Ethan allowed himself to hope that happiness might still be within reach. This hope, however, was tinged with guilt, the kind that made him question whether moving forward was a betrayal of Clara's memory. Ethan's nights were often sleepless, spent staring at the ceiling and contemplating his choices. Could he balance honoring Clara's memory while embracing a new chapter in his life? He wasn't sure, but the emptiness gnawed at him, urging him to take a step forward. It was this internal struggle that ultimately led him to a decision that would change everything. Ethan's introduction to Isabella came unexpectedly. She was vibrant, kind, and full of life, qualities that stood in stark contrast to the subdued existence Ethan had grown accustomed to. At 35, she was 10 years his junior, but her maturity and warmth bridged the gap effortlessly. They met at a community event, where Isabella's infectious laughter and genuine interest in others quickly caught Ethan's attention. It had been years since he'd felt drawn to someone, and her presence reignited something he thought he'd lost forever. Their connection deepened over the weeks that followed. Isabella's compassion and energy were a balm to Ethan's weary soul. She didn't try to replace Clara or diminish her memory. Instead, she offered Ethan a chance to rediscover joy and companionship. Their conversations flowed easily, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt lighter. The loneliness that had settled over his life began to lift, replaced by a cautious optimism. As their relationship blossomed, Ethan realized it was time to take the next step, introducing Isabella to Lucas. The thought filled him with both hope and trepidation. He knew how much Lucas still missed his mother, and the last thing Ethan wanted was to disrupt the fragile equilibrium they had worked so hard to maintain. Yet, he believed in Isabella's sincerity and her ability to navigate the delicate situation with grace. Ethan's decision was not without hesitation. He spent nights lying awake, wondering if bringing someone new into their lives would help or hurt Lucas. Ultimately, his desire to build a brighter future for both himself and his son outweighed his doubts, and he prepared for the momentous introduction. This choice, however, carried risks Ethan had not fully considered, risks that would soon manifest in ways he could not predict. The decision to introduce Isabella to Lucas was not one Ethan took lightly. He agonized over the potential impact it might have on his son, who had already endured so much. But he trusted Isabella's patience and understanding. She approached the meeting with genuine warmth, eager to forge a connection with Lucas. Lucas, now 20, greeted Isabella politely but kept his distance. The loss of his mother had left a void that no one could fill, and the idea of his father moving on felt foreign. Isabella, sensing his hesitation, took a gentle approach. She asked him about his college projects, his favorite sports, and even shared anecdotes about her own upbringing to find common ground. Slowly but surely, Lucas's guarded demeanor began to soften. Ethan watched these interactions with cautious optimism. Over time, Isabella's efforts bore fruit. She attended one of Lucas's soccer games, cheering loudly from the stands, and often encouraged him to share his goals and aspirations. Her sincerity and patience broke through the walls Lucas had built around himself. Gradually, the dinners that had once been tense and quiet became lively and filled with laughter. For Ethan, it was a relief to see his son smiling again. Despite the progress, Ethan couldn't ignore the occasional flicker of discomfort on Lucas's face. He chalked it up to the natural awkwardness of adjusting to a new dynamic, reassuring himself that time would heal any lingering wounds. But as Isabella continued to integrate herself into their lives, the undercurrent of tension persisted, unnoticed by Ethan but quietly growing stronger. What Ethan did not realize was that Lucas's reserved demeanor masked emotions he was struggling to understand. These feelings, innocent at first, were beginning to evolve into something far more complicated, setting the stage for a dynamic none of them could have foreseen. Encouraged by the growing bond between Isabella and Lucas, Ethan decided to take the next step in their relationship. After a quiet dinner at home, he proposed to Isabella. She said yes with tears of joy, and the engagement brought a renewed sense of purpose to their lives. The wedding was a small and intimate affair, attended only by close friends and family. For Ethan, it was a chance to rebuild the family he thought he had lost forever. Isabella's presence transformed the household. The once muted silence was replaced with warmth and liveliness. Laughter echoed through the halls again, and the atmosphere of the home began to feel lighter. Lucas seemed to embrace the new dynamic, his smiles coming more easily. Yet, beneath the surface, something darker began to take shape, something neither Ethan nor Isabella could foresee. Ethan, basking in his newfound happiness, overlooked the subtle shifts in Lucas's behavior. His son seemed distracted at times, his gaze lingering on Isabella a moment too long. Isabella, too, began to notice these changes but dismissed them as harmless. They both believed the family was healing, unaware that the bonds they were trying to strengthen were quietly fraying. The months following the wedding were filled with moments of joy, but they were interspersed with fleeting instances of tension. Ethan remained oblivious, convinced that their family was finally on the path to healing. But Lucas's inner turmoil was growing, and the cracks in their seemingly perfect facade were about to deepen. Lucas's feelings toward Isabella began to shift in ways that neither of them could have foreseen. At first, he admired her for the warmth she brought back into the household. But what started as innocent admiration soon morphed into something far more troubling. Lucas found himself drawn to Isabella in ways he struggled to understand or control. Initially, his gestures were small, offering to help with chores or lingering in the kitchen while she cooked. He'd find excuses to talk to her, his compliments becoming more pointed over time. "You're so easy to talk to," he'd say, or, "It's no wonder Dad fell for you." Isabella, sensing the potential awkwardness, laughed nervously and dismissed his remarks. But as the weeks passed, Lucas's attention grew more intense, and the boundaries of their relationship began to blur. One evening, while Ethan was working late, Lucas and Isabella found themselves alone in the living room. The dim lighting and quiet atmosphere created an unusual intimacy. As the credits of a movie rolled, Lucas turned to Isabella with a look that made her uncomfortable. "You're incredible," he said softly. Isabella shifted in her seat, offering a polite smile. "That's sweet of you to say," she replied, but Lucas wasn't done. "No, I mean it," he insisted, his tone growing bolder. "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen." Isabella froze, her heart racing. She stood abruptly, muttering something about checking on dinner. The interaction left her shaken, and she tried to convince herself it was a one-time lapse in judgment on Lucas's part. But the intensity of his gaze and the weight of his words lingered in her mind. She hoped it was a phase, but deep down, she feared it wasn't. As the days went on, Lucas's behavior became more intrusive. He found ways to be alone with Isabella, his compliments growing bolder, his presence more invasive. Isabella struggled with her unease, afraid to cause a rift in the family. Little did she know, Lucas's fixation was a ticking time bomb, ready to explode with devastating consequences. Lucas's growing fixation on Isabella reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. What had started as subtle, unspoken admiration had transformed into an unhealthy obsession. The boundaries between admiration and desire became increasingly blurred, and their interactions took on a charged energy that neither of them could fully address. One evening, Lucas crossed a line that changed everything. While Ethan was working late, Lucas lingered in the kitchen as Isabella prepared dinner. Standing close behind her, he reached for a bowl on the counter and allowed his hand to brush hers. Isabella froze, her heart pounding. "Lucas, what are you doing?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. Lucas hesitated for only a moment before responding. "I can't help it," he admitted. "You're all I think about." His voice was soft, almost pleading. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. "Lucas, this is inappropriate," she said firmly, stepping away. But a small part of her, buried beneath layers of guilt and denial, was flattered by his attention. It had been years since someone had looked at her that way, and the thrill of it lingered even as her rational mind screamed for her to put a stop to it. Despite her better judgment, Isabella found herself downplaying the incident, convincing herself it was a fleeting moment of confusion for Lucas. She didn't want to jeopardize the fragile harmony of their family, especially after all the effort Ethan had put into rebuilding it. But Lucas's obsession only deepened. He began finding excuses to touch her arm, brush against her shoulder, or linger too close during conversations. His gaze was always on her, heavy with longing, and his words carried a weight that unnerved her. Isabella's unease grew, but she didn't confide in Ethan, fearing the fallout such a revelation would bring. She hoped Lucas's feelings would fade, that time would restore their normalcy. But Lucas's obsession was not something that would resolve itself. It was a dangerous force, pulling them all toward a breaking point. Ethan's routine rarely changed. He was a creature of habit, leaving the house early in the morning and returning late in the evening after long days at work. He trusted both his son and his fiancée implicitly, believing their home to be a sanctuary of peace and stability. But even the most trusting hearts can sense when something is amiss. At first, Ethan noticed small changes in the household dynamic. Lucas seemed unusually attentive to Isabella, going out of his way to help her with mundane tasks. He would sit closer to her during family meals, his gaze lingering on her a moment too long. Isabella, for her part, seemed more reserved, her laughter slightly forced and her movements more cautious. One evening, Ethan walked into the living room and found Lucas and Isabella sitting together on the couch. They sprang apart the moment he entered, their faces flushed. When Ethan asked what was going on, Isabella quickly explained they had been discussing Lucas's college assignments. Ethan nodded, accepting her explanation, but a seed of doubt had been planted. Over time, these moments became more frequent. Ethan began to feel like an outsider in his own home, as if there were a conversation happening just beneath the surface that he wasn't privy to. The warm, easygoing atmosphere that had defined their household started to feel strained, weighed down by an invisible tension. Still, Ethan dismissed his suspicions. He reminded himself of the sacrifices Lucas had made to adjust to their new family dynamic and of Isabella's unwavering support throughout their relationship. But the uneasy feeling in his gut persisted, gnawing at the edges of his mind. He told himself he was imagining things, that his grief over Clara's death was making him overly sensitive. Yet, he couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. Ethan's trust in Lucas and Isabella had always been absolute, but cracks were beginning to form. What he didn't realize was that the truth was far darker than he could have imagined, and his worst fears were about to be confirmed. The day Ethan's world shattered began like any other. His construction site had closed early due to rain, giving him an unexpected chance to spend time at home. Wanting to surprise Isabella, he picked up her favorite flowers and a bottle of wine on his way back. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed Lucas's car parked outside. Odd, he thought. Lucas had mentioned he'd be at an evening class. Entering the house quietly, Ethan set the flowers on the counter. The house was unusually silent, save for faint voices coming from upstairs. His chest tightened as he made his way up the stairs, following the sound to Lucas's bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and as Ethan peered inside, the sight before him froze him in place. Lucas and Isabella were on the bed, their intimacy undeniable. They were laughing, their hands intertwined in a way that left no doubt about their relationship. Ethan's vision blurred with rage and disbelief. He backed away from the door, his heart pounding, his mind racing to comprehend the betrayal. Quietly, he descended the stairs and left the house, his movements mechanical. Sitting in his truck, Ethan gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The betrayal wasn't just an emotional wound, it was a desecration of everything he had worked so hard to rebuild. He replayed the scene over and over in his mind, each time fueling the fire of his rage. He thought of Clara, of the sacrifices he had made for Lucas, of the love and trust he had given Isabella. All of it had been destroyed in a single moment. That night, Ethan didn't confront them. Instead, he drove aimlessly through the rain, his thoughts consumed by anger and despair. When he finally returned home, the house was quiet. Lucas and Isabella acted as though nothing had happened, but Ethan's simmering rage was far from extinguished. He knew a confrontation was inevitable, but he needed time to plan, to decide how far he was willing to go. The days that followed were marked by a chilling silence. Ethan went about his routine as usual, but his demeanor had shifted. He was quieter, more withdrawn, his eyes carrying a cold intensity that made Isabella and Lucas uneasy. Neither of them knew that Ethan had witnessed their betrayal, and his silence only deepened their growing sense of foreboding. Ethan spent his nights lying awake, replaying the scene he had stumbled upon. He thought about the sacrifices he had made for Lucas, the love and trust he had given to Isabella, and the life he had built from the ashes of Clara's death. All of it had been undone in a single moment of betrayal. The anger that simmered within him grew darker, hardening into a desire for retribution. One morning, Isabella mentioned she would be visiting her sister for the weekend. Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. The moment she left, he turned his attention to Lucas. His son was lounging in the living room, completely unaware of the storm brewing within his father. "We need to talk," Ethan said, his tone colder than Lucas had ever heard. Lucas glanced up, surprised, and followed his father into the study. The room, normally a space of quiet reflection, now felt suffocating. Ethan closed the door behind them and turned to face Lucas. "I know about you and Isabella," he began, his voice trembling with controlled rage. "I saw you two together." Lucas's face drained of color. "Dad, it's not what you think." "Don't lie to me," Ethan snapped. "You betrayed me. Betrayed this family. How could you do this?" Lucas stammered an apology, tears streaming down his face, but Ethan was unmoved. "You will end this," he ordered. "And you will stay away from Isabella." Lucas nodded, but the confrontation had done little to quell Ethan's anger. The betrayal demanded more than words. It demanded justice. Ethan's fury consumed him, leaving no room for reason. That night, as the household settled into an uneasy silence, he made a fateful decision. Retrieving a heavy metal rod from the garage, he prepared to confront Lucas one final time. He told himself it was for the family's honor, for the trust that had been shattered beyond repair. He waited until the early hours of the morning, the house shrouded in darkness. Entering Lucas's room, he found his son asleep. The sight of Lucas, once his pride and joy, now filled him with a mix of rage and sorrow. "Wake up," Ethan commanded, his voice icy. Lucas stirred, his eyes widening as he saw the weapon in his father's hands. "Dad, what are you doing?" he stammered. Ethan didn't answer. "You've left me no choice," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. Raising the rod, he struck Lucas across the head, rendering him unconscious. For a moment, Ethan stood over his son's limp body, his chest heaving. But his rage was far from spent. Dragging Lucas's body to the backyard, Ethan began digging a shallow grave. The physical labor provided a twisted sense of relief, each shovelful of dirt a release for his pent-up fury. As dawn approached, Ethan placed Lucas in the grave, his movements mechanical. But as he began to cover the body with dirt, Lucas's eyes fluttered open, his weak cries barely audible. For a moment, Ethan hesitated. But the rage returned, overpowering any trace of humanity left within him. Without a word, he continued to bury his son alive, the muffled sounds of Lucas's pleas fading until there was nothing but silence. By the time Ethan finished, the sun was rising, casting long shadows across the yard. The deed was done, but the weight of his actions was only beginning to settle. Ethan returned to the house, his hands trembling as he washed away the dirt. He sat in the living room, staring into the void, waiting for the consequences of his actions to catch up with him. The morning after Lucas's disappearance, Isabella returned home, unaware of the horrors that had unfolded in her absence. As she stepped through the door, she immediately sensed that something was wrong. The house was eerily silent, and Ethan was sitting in the living room, his expression grim and unreadable. "Where's Lucas?" Isabella asked, her voice tinged with unease. Ethan's eyes met hers, cold and detached. "He's gone," he replied flatly. Isabella's heart raced as she tried to make sense of his words. "Gone? What do you mean?" "Don't play dumb," Ethan snapped, his voice laced with bitterness. "You think I didn't know about the two of you? The lies? The betrayal?" Isabella's face paled as the weight of his accusation sank in. She stammered an apology, trying to explain herself, but Ethan cut her off. "It's too late for that," he said, standing up and towering over her. "I took care of it. He won't come between us again." Isabella's blood ran cold. She backed away, her mind racing with fear and disbelief. "What did you do, Ethan?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he walked past her, heading upstairs. Isabella, overwhelmed by terror, grabbed her phone and dialed 911. She barricaded herself in the bedroom, her hands shaking as she reported what she suspected had happened. "Please, send someone quickly," she pleaded. I think my husband killed his son." Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air. Police officers arrived and entered the house cautiously. Ethan, eerily calm, surrendered without resistance. As he was led away in handcuffs, he offered no explanation for his actions, his face a mask of quiet resignation. The officers wasted no time searching the property. Guided by Isabella's frantic account, they focused on the backyard, where they found a patch of freshly disturbed soil. It didn't take long for their worst fears to be confirmed. As they exhumed the shallow grave, the sight of Lucas's lifeless body brought the grim reality of Ethan's actions into sharp focus. Isabella watched from the window, her heart shattered by the scene unfolding before her. Guilt and despair consumed her as she realized the part she had played in the events that led to this tragedy. Though she hadn't intended for things to spiral out of control, her actions had set the stage for Ethan's descent into darkness. The investigation revealed the full extent of Ethan's rage and premeditation. Interviews with neighbors and colleagues painted a picture of a man who had been quietly unraveling for weeks. His meticulous planning and cold execution of the crime shocked even the most seasoned detectives. The discovery of the metal rod in the garage, still stained with blood, further corroborated Ethan's confession. Isabella's cooperation with the authorities was critical in piecing together the timeline of events. She recounted the growing tension between Ethan and Lucas, as well as her own complicity in allowing the situation to escalate. Her testimony, though damning, was also a plea for understanding. She hoped that by telling the truth, she could bring some measure of justice to Lucas's memory. The community, once sympathetic to Ethan's struggles as a widower and single father, was now united in its condemnation of his actions. The trial that followed became a spectacle, drawing national attention and sparking debates about morality, betrayal, and the limits of forgiveness. The courtroom was packed as Ethan's trial began. Journalists, spectators, and legal experts filled every available seat, eager to witness the culmination of one of the most sensational cases in recent memory. Ethan, dressed in a plain suit, appeared composed as he listened to the charges against him, murder, assault, and obstruction of justice. The prosecution painted a damning portrait of Ethan as a man consumed by jealousy and rage. They described in chilling detail how he had plotted Lucas's murder, using the evidence collected from the crime scene to build a compelling case. The prosecutor's opening statement set the tone for the trial. This was not a crime of passion. This was premeditated, calculated, and carried out with cold intent. Isabella's testimony was a key moment in the trial. Her voice shook as she recounted the night Ethan confessed to her, the fear she felt as she realized what he had done, and the guilt she carried for her role in the events leading up to Lucas's death. The defense attempted to discredit her, suggesting that her affair with Lucas made her an unreliable witness. But Isabella's raw emotion and honesty resonated with the jury, adding weight to the prosecution's case. Ethan's defense team argued that his actions were driven by temporary insanity, a desperate response to the overwhelming betrayal he had suffered. They called character witnesses to attest to his years of devotion as a father and husband, painting a picture of a man who had been pushed to the brink. But the jury, faced with the harrowing evidence of his crime, found little sympathy for his plight. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict, guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Ethan to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a punishment that reflected the gravity of his actions and the irreparable harm he had caused. In the wake of the trial, the community struggled to make sense of the tragedy. Ethan's story became a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of how unchecked emotions and unresolved grief could lead to catastrophic consequences. The house where the Hayes family had once lived remained vacant, its walls bearing silent witness to the events that had unfolded within. Isabella left town shortly after the trial, unable to bear the weight of her guilt and the judgment of those around her. She moved to a small city far from the memories of her past, hoping to rebuild her life and find some measure of peace. Though she never forgave herself for her role in Lucas's death, she dedicated her time to advocacy work, speaking out about the dangers of emotional manipulation and the importance of seeking help in times of crisis. Lucas's friends and classmates held a memorial service in his honor, remembering him as a bright, ambitious young man whose life had been cut tragically short. His death left a void in the lives of those who knew him, a loss that could never be fully healed. As for Ethan, he began serving his sentence in a maximum security prison. The man who had once been defined by his strength and resilience now spent his days in solitude, haunted by the choices he had made. Letters from the outside world went unanswered, and Ethan refused all visitors, retreating into himself as he grappled with the weight of his guilt. Ethan's story became a topic of discussion in schools, community centers, and online forums, sparking debates about morality, mental health, and the consequences of betrayal. Some viewed him as a victim of circumstance, a man driven to madness by heartbreak and deception. Others saw him as a monster, incapable of controlling his rage and willing to destroy everything he held dear. Psychologists and criminologists analyzed the case, highlighting the warning signs that had been overlooked and the psychological toll of grief and isolation. Ethan's descent into darkness was seen as a failure of support systems, a cautionary tale of what could happen when emotional pain was left unchecked. Silent Crime Case, the channel that covered Ethan's story, gained a surge in popularity as viewers grappled with the moral complexities of the case. Comments flooded in, ranging from sympathy for Ethan's struggles to condemnation of his actions. The story resonated deeply, forcing viewers to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the fragility of trust. As time passed, the story of Ethan, Isabella, and Lucas faded from headlines but remained etched in the memories of those it had touched. The lessons learned from their tragedy served as a reminder of the devastating consequences of betrayal, obsession, and unaddressed grief. And while the Hayes family's story ended in heartbreak, it left behind a legacy of caution and reflection, urging others to seek help and understanding before it was too late. Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey into the shadows of betrayal and vengeance. The story of Ethan, Isabella, and Lucas reminds us how fragile trust can be, and how devastating the consequences are when it's shattered. At Silent Crime Case, we strive to uncover the untold truths behind the headlines, exploring the dark corners of human emotions and the choices that lead to unthinkable actions. What do you think about this case? Was Ethan driven by betrayal and grief, or was this tragedy inevitable from the start? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective.